Hey everybody, I'm Rabbi Lehrfield, and this is 0%, where we explore world-changing ideas introduced by Judaism. I know we've been on a bit of a break from our main topic, and I promise we will get back there soon, but not this week. This week, we're going to talk a little bit about Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Last week, the Jewish world suffered an irreparable loss with the death of the man known as the Sar HaTorah, the Prince of Torah, Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Rav Chaim was considered by all to be the Gadol Hador, which means the great of the generation. And this is a title or a position, or really a lack of a position, that's really hard for modern Americans to comprehend because we don't really have a parallel anywhere in our world like this. A couple years ago on one of our Israel trips, we were talking about some great sage, and one of the guys on the trip asked me, well, how does somebody get elected to that position? How does someone become the Gadol Hador? And he asked me, is there like an election process? Does the person campaign? And I remember being so taken aback by the question. I thought it was such an interesting question because Jewish positions of leadership are not ones that somebody seeks out. The positions generally seek them. When you look historically at great Jewish leaders, whether it's Moses himself, who said, I'm not the right man for the job, I can't do it, or Aaron, just in last week's Torah portion, who was hesitant to begin service in the temple. These are people who didn't think they were the best people for the job, even though perhaps they were. But they certainly weren't looking for the position. A Jewish leader is not somebody who is campaigning for the position. And that's something that is so foreign to us. Because the people that we know, those who are famous that we look up to, those people in positions of influence and power, are almost always people who have been vying for that position. People who are spending millions of dollars on a campaign to tell the world why they belong in that seat of power, why we should choose them. But when it comes to Jewish leaders, they're the people who are running away from the spotlight. There's no election. There's no committee that gets together to decide, well, who is going to become the next great sage? So how, as my friend asked me in Israel, does the process work? Where does a Gadol Hador come from? Rav Chaim Kanievsky was a man who not only did he not have a phone, and when I say that, I don't mean he didn't have a smartphone. I mean, he literally did not have a telephone. He only spoke on the phone twice in his entire life, and yet had over 1 million followers. Millions of people who followed him, not on Twitter or on social media, but actually followed him. How does that happen? Rav Chaim Kanievsky was born on January 8th, 1928. And he was the son of Rav Yaakov Kanievsky, who was a great sage known as the Stipler Gaon. His uncle, his mother's brother, was Rav Avram Yeshayahu Karelitz, otherwise known as the Chazon Ish. His wife, who passed away in 2011, was Rebbetzin Batsheva Kanievsky, who was the daughter of Rav Shalom Elyashiv, who, when he died at the age of 102, was considered by all to be the leading halachic authority, the leading authority on all matters of Jewish law. She was also the granddaughter of Rav Aryeh Levine. I think in our love episode, I shared a story, and if I didn't, here it is for the first time, but a famous story of Rav Aryeh Levine, who was considered the tzaddik of Jerusalem, the righteous one of Jerusalem, where he had escorted his wife to the doctor. And when the doctor asked what the problem was, he said, our leg hurts, in the plural, our, because he really saw his wife as an extension of himself. And we pointed out, I think, in the love class, how that is true love. True love is when one sees the other person as an extension of themselves, and how much more so if we as the Jewish people and we as all humanity truly saw each other as an extension of one being, how different our world would be. Can you imagine, the Talmud in Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud gives the example, imagine you're cutting a tomato and you accidentally slip and you slice your hand. Can you imagine how insane it would be for your right hand to start beating up your left hand? It's insane. It makes no sense. They're both parts of you. And so when somebody does something to slight us or hurt us, yes, we feel pain and we feel hurt. But when we retaliate in a way that Will Smith did to Chris Rock, when we retaliate in that way, what it's really doing and what it's showing is that we don't see ourselves as one being and one body. We see ourselves as very separate and very different. But in any event, Rav Chaim was clearly the member of a very illustrious family. The son of the Steipler Gaon, the nephew of the Chazon Ish, the son-in-law of Rav Elyashiv, the grandson-in-law of Rav Aryeh Levine. And there's a famous idea that yichus, or lineage, is a bunch of zeros. If you put a 1 in front of all of those zeros, you get a billion, you get a trillion. If it's just zeros, then that's all it is. It's nothing. And that's the idea of the importance of lineage, that when you grow up with those kind of influences and you allow them to influence you properly, there is no limit to the greatness that can be achieved. And that is exactly what we saw with Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Rav Chaim Kanievsky was a man who spent his entire life steeped in Torah learning. It's said that he went through the entire corpus of Jewish knowledge, of Jewish learning, every single year. I'm not just talking about the Talmud. Those who learn Daf Yomi, you finish the cycle in 7.5 years. And most people I know who are learning Daf Yomi are going through it very quickly without commentary. I'm talking about the entire Talmud, both the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, with all its commentary. The entire Tanakh, the 24 books of the Bible, the Mishnah, the Midrashim, the Zohar, the works of Jewish law, including the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, Torah, Shulchan Aruch, everything. Anything that you can think of. Rav Chaim Kanievsky finished every single year. On a year like this one, which is a Jewish leap year, there's an extra month added. We had a whole episode talking about the Jewish calendar. You can go back and refer to that if you don't know what I'm talking about. So on a year like this, there's a whole extra month. And Rav Chaim didn't let anything linger. So if he finished the entire corpus of Jewish literature every single year, now on a leap year, that means he gets an extra month. So he has a whole extra month of learning that he wouldn't have had otherwise. And he spent that time writing. And he wrote tremendous volumes of books. And those books were written during that extra month of a Jewish leap year with all the extra time he had. And he didn't just write books on Talmudic topics or things that were, quote unquote, the standard things that great sages write about. He specifically chose to write about esoteric concepts, esoteric ideas, areas of Jewish law that nobody else was writing about, that nobody else was really thinking about. And I just want you to allow that to sink in for a second. Some people spend a full year sabbatical working on writing a book. Some people spend literally years of their life writing a book. And here Rav Chaim would, with his spare change, with the amount of time he has left over, his little extra, after finishing the entirety of all of Jewish knowledge and Torah within a year, he would spend this extra time writing an entire volume of far out esoteric concepts. What's remarkable about Rav Chaim is that, among many, many things, but what's remarkable is that he never held any official position. His father, the Steipler Gaon, made it clear to him and said, your job, your contribution to the Jewish people is to sit and learn. Period. Nothing else. And Rav Chaim never wavered from that advice. And that's how he became the paradigm of a student of Torah. Somebody who sat diligently, non-stop studying for 17, 18, 19 hours a day straight. And in case you think it came easy to him, and granted, he came from one of the most illustrious, if not the most illustrious families in all of Jewish history, but that doesn't mean that all of this came automatic to him. Rabbi Alon Tolin, who was the founder of Aish Detroit, once before he made it to Detroit when he was still in Jerusalem, brought a bunch of Bachrim, a bunch of students from the Aish Yeshiva to visit the Steipler, Rav Chaim's father. And they came to the stipler to get some words of inspiration and some blessings, but the stipler wasn't able to give them as much time. He wasn't doing well physically. So they went to Rav Chaim, his son. And Rav Chaim turned to this group of young yeshiva students, and he told them a story. He said there was once a boy who wasn't excelling very much at his studies. He was having a really hard time grasping the lectures in school. And so his father took him to the Chazon Ish, the great sage, the Chazon Ish, for advice. And the Chazon Ish said, drop out of school. Stop going to these lessons because they're clearly not working for you. And instead, the Chazon Ish told him to study several lines. There's a couple lines, 4, 5, 6 lines of Mishnah. Study them over and over again until you know it well, and then come back to me. And he studied those lines of Mishnayos. He came back, and the Chazon Ish tested him, and then he gave him a few more lines, and a few more lines of Talmud, of Gemara, and a few more lines, and a few more lines. And he kept on adding to that. And Rav Chaim said, that little boy was me. That young yeshiva student who didn't feel like he could really grasp the information that was being taught in school, after diligently working line after line, reviewing it over and over again, he became Rav Chaim Kanievsky that we know today. The Rav Chaim Kanievsky that left behind a void so large it really, really cannot be filled. 23 Rashbam Street, the small 2-bedroom apartment in Bnei Brak where Rav Chaim lived, was the address of the Jewish people. I had the opportunity to come see Rav Chaim in his home twice in my life, and it was really a remarkable thing to see. People lining up around the block and up the stairs and winding through this tiny apartment, this apartment that was filled to the brim. Every square inch you can see was filled with bookshelves and books piled on top of one another. And Rav Chaim could tell you every single book, not just where the book was and where to find it and what the content of it was, but he knew the content by heart. He could tell you every single nuance of every single text of every single book that lined his house. In fact, his son tells over the story that when they were children, one of the games they would play on Shabbos is that a child would get to pick a book by, randomly throughout the apartment, and Rav Chaim would tell them where the book was and everything about what was contained within it, to the extent that he could tell you every single time a specific word was found in any Jewish literature. He can tell you the number of times that specific Talmudic scholars had arguments. He had Google-level command of the entire canon of Jewish writings at his fingertips. He was once asked how many times the name Moshe appears in the Torah. And whenever he was asked a question like this, you can see him actually counting in his mind. Rav Chaim made a quick calculation and replied, 614. The questioner said that when he did a computer search, the computer search came back with 616. So Rav Chaim explained how the computer made a mistake. He said, while the name Moshe is written 614 times, you can find the same letter combination of the Mem, Shin, and Hey an additional 2 times. Once in Exodus 12:14 and another time in Deuteronomy 15:2. But they were spelling different words. It wasn't really Moshe's name. A computer couldn't do that, but Rav Chaim could. There's a well-known idea that we never find the letters Gimel and Tes, the Hebrew letters Gimel and Tes, found next to each other in a Hebrew word, because together the Gimel and Tes spell get, which is referred to as a Jewish divorce. And because that is something so tragic, of course necessary sometimes, and Judaism does have the option of divorce when it's necessary, but because it's something that is so traumatic, those letters are never found next to each other in a Hebrew word. So Rav Chaim was once asked about that, and he immediately mentioned, that's true, we never find a Gimel and a Tes next to each other, but we also never find a Gimel and a Kuf, or a Zayin and a Tes, or a Zayin and a Tzadi, or a Samach and a Tzadi. I don't know that he explained why, but he knew exactly which combinations of letters we never find in any other Hebrew word. He spent so much of his life studying Torah that he literally became the Torah he studied. When someone interacted with him, it was like they were interacting with the Torah itself. And that's why he was known as the Sar HaTorah, the Prince of Torah. Because when someone saw him, they saw the crown of Torah itself. It may have been a tiny 2-bedroom apartment, but the enormity of the Torah wisdom that came out of that home was truly not to be believed. But people left that home with so much more. People came and traveled from around the world to spend moments with Rav Chaim, and he always had time for the people. And this is somebody who was known for brevity. He never wasted a second. If you wrote Rav Chaim a question, he would respond with one-word answers, sometimes even less than a word. If he could just underline something in your question to answer the question, that's all he did. And you understood exactly what he meant. People came and they poured their heart out to him. They asked him questions and advice. They came to him for blessings and guidance. And his home was open to everyone. If they told these stories about you or me, it wouldn't be so remarkable. But this is somebody who literally planned out every single second of his day, from the time he woke up in the middle of the night to recite what's known as Tikkun Chatzos, a set of prayers that are specifically said in the middle of the night when it's the most auspicious time for prayer, to his inconceivable learning schedule. And yet there are stories told of a young student that came to him to ask a question on a piece of Talmud, and the student had a debilitating stutter. And Rav Chaim sat there listening to the question, stroking his hand and giving him encouragement for 40 minutes until the boy got the question out, and then he answered it. His care and concern for others was remarkable. He, despite the long lines of people that were waiting to see him, if there was a young child waiting online, and oftentimes there were young children who came to Rav Chaim for a blessing by their 3rd birthday before they got their traditional haircut, Rav Chaim would make sure that they would skip the line and come up ahead because it was so difficult for young children to wait online. His son shared that his father never ate a meal without his wife, Rebbetzin Bat Sheva, no matter what. If his wife wasn't available for lunch or dinner, he just wouldn't eat. Because he wasn't eating to satiate his body. His meals were a time to spend with his wife. Reporters will talk about the close to 1 million people who gathered to pay their final respects. They'll talk about the date of his birth and the date of death, but none of that truly does it justice. This profound loss is not something that we can easily comprehend because we don't fully understand what we had. And without knowing what we had, we can't know what we lost.